On March 8, 1862, the U.S. Navy frigate Cumberland lay anchored in Hampton Roads near Norfolk, Virginia. Not long after sunrise, a lookout posted in her rigging noted a spume of black smoke 10 miles to the south at the mouth of the Elizabeth River. Everyone on the Cumberland knew that further up that river at the Gosport Navy shipyards, secessionists had been working for months to turn the former steam frigate USS Merrimack into something else. So now the lookout's hail was like an electric shock. "That thing," he yelled, "is a-comin' down." And there it was, a dark, squat, iron-covered machine of war, belching black smoke and moving ponderously across the roadstead toward the anchored Cumberland. It looked nothing at all like a warship or indeed a ship of any kind. There were no masts, no spars, no rigging, not even a deck. Its entire superstructure was covered with iron plate. Though its iron-armored superstructure had been built on the hull of the Merrimack, the Confederates had given her another name, the CSS Virginia. Whatever she was called, here was an entirely new thing in naval warfare. As she steamed slowly across the roadstead, her top speed was only 5 knots, the Cumberland, as well as other Union ships in the anchorage, fired at her, though when they did, the shells simply bounced harmlessly off her iron skin. She drew closer and closer and then drove her iron bow ram directly into the Cumberland's starboard side. The gunners on the Cumberland continued to fire even as their ship sank beneath them. With some difficulty, the ironclad Virginia backed off, and while the Cumberland sank, the ironclad turned its attention to another nearby warship, the sailing frigate Congress, which was in water too shallow for the Virginia to ram her, so the ironclad stood off and fired round after round of hot shot into the frigate's wooden hull until she was on fire. She burned all day and exploded later that night. In these 2 engagements, 261 Union sailors died, another 108 were wounded, and both ships were a complete loss. It was the greatest defeat in the history of the U.S. Navy. But help was on the way. That night, as the Congress continued to burn, an even stranger-looking vessel crept into Hampton Roads after a long run down from New York. This one, a witness recalled, looked like a hat box on a raft. It had a flat deck only inches above the waterline, and in the middle of that deck was a single round turret that hosted 2 guns, though they were huge 11-inch guns, each of which could fire a 166-pound iron bolt. It was, of course, the USS Monitor, which had been built in only 100 days, arriving only now after a long run down from New York. The next morning, March 9th, the 2 iron-armored warships met. Though they fought for 4 hours, often at point-blank range, neither was able to inflict fatal damage on the other. Both sides claimed victory. The South argued that the Virginia won because the Monitor withdrew after her captain, John Worden, was temporarily blinded by a shot that struck the Monitor's pilot house while he was looking out. The North claimed victory on the grounds that the Virginia, or the Merrimack as the North continued to call her, subsequently headed back up the Elizabeth River. The North had the better argument, because the withdrawal of the Virginia allowed the Union Naval Squadron to remain in Hampton Roads, and that, in turn, allowed the Union Army of Major General George B. McClellan to continue its campaign there, though in the end, that campaign ended in failure. Nevertheless, this first battle between iron-armored warships showed how new technology was dramatically changing the character of naval combat. The American Civil War was the most traumatic event in the nation's history. By the time it ended, as many as 800,000 men had been killed, and the nation itself had been transformed. Technically, the war began on April 12, 1861, when Confederate soldiers in Charleston Harbor fired on the Union garrison in Fort Sumter, though the roots of the war stretch back at least to the nation's founding and even earlier. The seeds were planted when a British privateer, the White Lion, arrived at Jamestown in Virginia in 1619 with about 20 Africans. They had been kidnapped from what is now Angola by the Portuguese and then captured at sea by the White Lion. Buying them was not a planned decision. Nobody in Jamestown or anywhere else said, "Hey, I have an idea, let's have slavery." Buying these Africans was a purely pragmatic decision based on the colony's desperate need for manpower to help clear the forests and construct shelter for the coming winter. And so, when the White Lion showed up offering these Africans in exchange for food and supplies, it seemed providential. It is a cautionary tale of how short-term decisions can cast long shadows. By the 1830s, the number of enslaved persons in the United States had grown to more than 2 million, and attitudes about slavery had both diverged and hardened. At the same time, due largely to the adoption of the cotton gin, slavery had become astonishingly profitable. There was a psychological factor at work here too. The emergence of an often sanctimonious abolitionist movement in the North, plus the rebellion of Nat Turner in Virginia in 1831, and the fear of other such rebellions made Southerners defensive about their peculiar institution. By 1850, stark lines had been drawn between so-called free states and slave states. As the nation divided, the U.S. Navy underwent a quiet technological revolution. The biggest change was the adoption of steam power. Until then, the United States had lagged behind European navies in the adoption of steam, mainly because the U.S. lacked overseas coaling stations to keep steamships supplied with fuel. But by 1840, it had become obvious that clinging to sail power was not a realistic long-term strategy. An American sailing ship would be all but helpless in a fight against a Royal Navy steamship of the same relative strength. So in the 1840s and 50s, the U.S. Navy began to embrace steam propulsion. Matthew Perry's expedition to Japan in 1852 had included 3 steam-powered warships. There was some discussion about whether it was better to employ paddle wheels or propellers on the early steamships. Paddle wheels churned up the water impressively, but they also occupied the space where there would otherwise be a long row of guns. Then, too, those big paddle wheels offered an irresistible target, almost as if they had a big red bullseye painted on them. In 1843, the United States commissioned the first propeller-driven steam warship in the world, beating the Royal Navy's Rattlesnake to sea by only a few months. This ship was the USS Princeton, designed by Swedish immigrant John Ericsson. Alas, during a public relations cruise on the Potomac River to show off the ship's virtues, one of her large caliber guns exploded, killing both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Navy, which temporarily muted enthusiasm for more naval experimentation. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Though slavery had been banned from that area by the Missouri Compromise, this new act would allow settlers to decide for themselves if they wanted to have slavery. The new law precipitated violent clashes in Kansas between pro- and anti-slavery settlers. That same year, completely unrelated to the sectional violence, Congress authorized the construction of 6 new large steam-powered frigates, all of them named for American rivers. In one of history's many ironies, the lead ship of this class was the USS Merrimack. When the Merrimack was launched in 1855, it carried a full suit of sails, though her character as a propeller-driven steamship was evident because of the smokestack between her mainmast and her foremast. The 6 Merrimack-class frigates were followed by 5 Hartford-class steam sloops. The Hartford, too, would later become famous as the flagship of David Glasgow Farragut, for it was from her rigging that Farragut shouted his famous order to damn the torpedoes as he directed her into Mobile Bay. These new appropriations and others that followed meant that in the 5 years between 1854 and 1859, that is, between the Kansas-Nebraska Act and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, the U.S. Navy added 24 major new naval warships, all of them steamers, and all of them armed with the latest and most sophisticated naval ordnance. Naval ordnance, too, underwent a significant revolution on the eve of the Civil War. For most of 200 years, naval guns had changed little. They consisted of muzzle-loaded iron tubes that fired solid iron balls using black powder. The various sizes of the guns had been determined by the weight of the iron ball they fired, 12-pounders, 24-pounders, and so on. But improvements in metallurgy meant that naval guns were now much larger, so large that they were categorized not by the weight of the cannonball they fired, but by the diameter of their muzzles, as in 6-inch guns or 8-inch guns. The USS Monitor arrived in Hampton Roads armed with 2 11-inch guns. The most common naval gun during the Civil War was a 9-inch smoothbore cannon that had been designed by John A. Dahlgren, who commanded the Washington Navy Yard and established the Bureau of Ordnance there. One problem with these larger naval guns was that they were so heavy they could not be supported by the wooden deck of most Navy warships. Was it possible to design a large caliber gun that was not so heavy? To find out, Dahlgren conducted a series of experiments. He discovered that the greatest pressure on a gun barrel was at the breech, where the powder charge exploded. After that, the pressure diminished quickly, before increasing again just as the projectile exited the muzzle. So he designed a gun barrel that was fat at the breech, where the pressure was greatest, then narrowed quickly before flaring out again at the muzzle. Many observers thought it looked like a soda bottle turned on its side. Another change in naval ordnance was that some of the barrels on naval guns could be rifled. That is, have grooves cut in a spiral pattern on the inside of the barrel so that the projectiles emerge spinning, like a pass from a skilled quarterback. That increased both their accuracy and their range, whereas naval battles in the age of sail often took place at a range of less than 100 yards. The newer naval guns could fire a mile or more. And the projectiles they fired also changed. While the new naval guns could still fire solid iron balls, they also fired explosive shells. The 9-inch Dahlgren gun, for example, could fire either a 90-pound solid shot or a 73-pound explosive shell. These innovations gave warship ordnance vastly greater range, accuracy, and destructive power just as the Civil War began. The Civil War itself was triggered by the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Lincoln was not an abolitionist, but he had run for president on a platform of halting the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Because Southerners believed that limiting the growth of slavery would eventually lead to its demise, they believed that such limits were an existential threat. Consequently, when Lincoln was elected, 7 Southern states announced their secession from the Union. Several months later, Lincoln refused to withdraw the U.S. Army garrison from Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and Confederate artillerists opened fire on it. The sectional dispute that had festered for decades burst into open warfare. One of Lincoln's first decisions as a war president was to announce a naval blockade of the southern coast. It was startlingly ambitious. Though many of the Navy's warships were relatively new and equipped with modern ordnance, there were only 42 of them in 1861. Because of that, the initial reaction to Lincoln's declaration was ridicule, even mockery. According to international convention, no nation had to respect a blockade unless there was an actual naval force offshore to enforce it. You couldn't just say that the South was blockaded. You actually had to do it. The obvious first task then was to get more ships, a lot more ships. Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, sent the few ships he did have down to loiter off several southern ports, including Charleston, and he ordered home all the ships in the various overseas squadrons. He also contracted with builders to construct 23 new steam warships, stipulating that they had to be ready to go to sea in only 90 days. He had no congressional authorization to do any of these things, but he took the chance that Congress would ratify his decisions afterward, which it did. Still, all that yielded a total of only about 100 ships, a far cry from what was needed. The shortfall was mostly made up by buying scores of steam-powered civilian merchant ships, many of them paddle wheel steamers, and modifying them so they could carry a few naval guns. Eventually, the United States commissioned more than 400 of these ersatz warships. So during the first few months of the war, the blockade existed mostly in name only, and that would have been the time for Confederates to flood the international market with their goods, especially cotton, in order to gain overseas credits for the supplies they would need. Instead, convinced that Europe, and especially England, was desperate for Southern cotton and would do anything to get it, the Confederate Congress embargoed its own cotton exports, expecting that the British would send their navy across the Atlantic and open Southern ports to get it. It didn't work. Because the British had long depended on blockade as a principal weapon against their European foes, they were unwilling to do anything to undermine the legitimacy of blockades in general. So in the end, they found alternate sources of cotton in Egypt and India. Still, Anglo-American relations were often precarious during the war. The most dangerous moment came in November of 1861 when U.S. Navy Captain Charles Wilkes stopped the British mail packet Trent and forcibly removed two Confederate emissaries who were bound for Britain and France. England was so outraged by the so-called Trent affair that it actually began preparations for war, though thanks to cooler heads on both sides, it never came to that. For administrative purposes, the Union blockade was divided into 4 squadrons, 2 in the Gulf of Mexico, 2 along the Atlantic coast. Because all but a handful of the blockading ships were steam-powered, each squadron required a base where the ships could recoal and resupply. The West Gulf Squadron used Ship Island off the coast of Mississippi. The East Gulf Squadron operated out of Key West. The North Atlantic Squadron used Hampton Roads, but there was no place on the South Atlantic coast where that squadron, arguably the most important one, could safely operate. To address that, the first major U.S. Navy effort of the war was to capture Port Royal Sound on the South Carolina coast, about halfway between Charleston and Savannah. The expedition was led by Navy Captain Samuel Francis DuPont, who attacked the Confederate forts in Port Royal on November 7, 1861. Now, up to this moment, it was universally assumed that guns in forts were vastly superior to guns afloat. Forts usually had bigger guns, a more stable firing platform, and they were protected by heavy earthworks. And of course, forts could not sink. Yet the dramatic improvements in naval ordnance over the previous decade had changed that. The naval guns on DuPont's ships were at least as powerful as the rebel guns ashore. They fired explosive shells, and because his steam-powered warships could maneuver, independent of the wind and the current, they were moving targets. In only a few hours, DuPont's flotilla compelled the surrender of the Confederate forts at Port Royal, and the Navy had its base on the South Atlantic coast. Though it was a small victory in the long and bloody history of the Civil War, DuPont's success at Port Royal had an important and lasting effect. One of the witnesses to it was Robert E. Lee, who had been sent there by Confederate President Jefferson Davis to assess the South's coastal defenses. Lee concluded that Union ships could move up and down the coast faster than Southern soldiers could march from place to place. Trying to defend everywhere, he argued, would use up scarce manpower. He suggested that except at a few critical sites, such as Charleston and Mobile, the South should effectively abandon its coastline, which it did. Maintaining the blockade was tedious work for the officers and men who had to do it. The blockading ships spent days and weeks loitering about the entrance to one port or another. Boredom would turn suddenly to frenzy when a ship tested the blockade, almost always at night, sometimes in foggy or rainy weather. The blockaders would slip their anchors and take off in pursuit. They managed to catch a number of blockade runners, but inevitably some got in and others got out. Was it worth it? After all, the Confederacy managed to import a significant number of rifles and cannon, as well as powder and lead, through the blockade. No rebel army ever lost a battle because it ran out of military equipment. And when rebel armies did suffer shortages, it was often because of weaknesses in its internal transportation network, especially its railroads. Nevertheless, the blockade dramatically reduced the overall amount of trade. In the first 18 months of the war, the number of ships entering or exiting southern ports fell by more than 90%. That led to shortages, contributed to inflation, and had a long-term wearing effect on Southern morale. As for the Confederate Navy, it had to start completely from scratch. And because it did, the Confederates proved more willing to embrace experimental technology. The classic example of that, of course, is the transformation of the Merrimac into the Virginia. But the Confederacy also experimented with underwater mines, even a submarine. After the standoff between the Merrimac and the Monitor in Hampton Roads in March of 1862, both sides built more ironclads. The North built dozens of them, most of them larger clones of the original Monitor. The South also sought to build more ironclads, most of them looking much like the Virginia, but with its weaker industrial base, the Confederacy could not match Northern production and never built enough to challenge Union naval superiority. Another Confederate innovation was the underwater mine, or what was then called a torpedo. Initially, both sides considered the use of such weapons as inhumane, even dishonorable. Secretly planting inanimate explosive devices to kill your enemy struck many at the time as callous and sadistic. But as the war lengthened and the casualties mounted, such considerations fell away. This, by the way, is characteristic of nearly all wars. The longer a war lasts, the more likely it is that the so-called rules of war will broaden to tolerate, even embrace, actions that were previously considered beyond the pale. Finally and famously, the Confederacy developed a working submarine. The idea of attacking an enemy ship from underwater was not new. David Bushnell had developed such a vessel during the American Revolution. He called it the Turtle, and in September 1776, as the British were preparing to occupy New York, it tried to attach an explosive device to the Royal Navy ship of the line HMS Eagle, though the attempt failed. 88 years later, the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley succeeded where the Turtle had not. Named for her inventor and owner, who lost his life in an early trial of the submersible boat, the Hunley was propelled by a crew of 8 men who operated a hand crank to turn her propeller. On the night of February 17, 1864, it left Charleston Harbor to attack one of the Union blockading ships, the USS Housatonic. To do that, it carried an explosive device at the end of a long spar extended from the bow. Lookouts on the Housatonic spied the curious log-like vessel approaching just under the surface and shouted a belated warning. The Hunley's commander, Confederate Navy Lieutenant John Payne, successfully detonated the torpedo, and the resulting explosion opened a large hole in the Housatonic's hull. The Housatonic sank, but the Hunley never returned. For years, it was assumed that she had been destroyed by the explosion. The discovery of her remains in 1995 suggested otherwise. It now seems likely that she survived the attack and that Payne deliberately kept her on the bottom, waiting for the commotion on the surface to pass. While he waited, the crew very likely ran out of air and quietly died. All 8 men were still at their stations when the craft was recovered in 2000. In addition to ironclads, mines, and submarines, the Confederacy also relied on the traditional strategy of weaker naval powers, which is commerce raiding. Attacking an enemy's trade had been the principal strategic gambit of the United States during both the American Revolution and the War of 1812. Now the Confederates sought to use it against the United States. Much of the commerce raiding in America's earlier wars had been conducted by privateers. But the principal motive of privateers is the profit to be made by bringing their prizes into port. And the South could not bring its prizes into port because of the Union blockade. The British Declaration of Neutrality closed her ports to rebel prizes as well. Consequently, privateering died out quickly, and Confederate commerce raiding had to be carried out by commissioned warships, many of which were built in England. The most successful of them was the CSS Alabama, built at the Birkenhead shipyard near Liverpool. Under the command of Raphael Semmes, the Alabama captured and burned some 64 Union merchant ships. It even defeated the U.S. Navy warship Hatteras in the Gulf of Mexico, which was the first time a steam warship sunk another steam warship in battle. The predations of the Alabama and her sister ships like the Florida and the Shenandoah caused great alarm among Union shippers, though in the end it did not compel the Union states to weaken the blockade. Given that, the same question we asked about the blockade can also be asked about Confederate commerce raiding. Was it worth it? Confederate raiders sank or burned 150,000 tons of Union shipping during the war. Moreover, many Union ship owners reflagged their ships under foreign registry to protect them from these raiders. Yet, distressful as all that was, commerce raiding did not damage the Northern economy nearly as much as the blockade damaged the Southern economy. Commerce raiding was an appropriate strategy for the Confederacy. It was just not enough. The Alabama herself sank in June of 1864 after a duel with the USS Kearsarge off the coast of France. Eventually, the other raiders too were either captured or sunk. The last of them, the CSS Shenandoah, was still at sea in the North Pacific when the war ended. It returned to England and hauled down its flag on November 6, 1865, 7 months after Lee's surrender at Appomattox.